Not going to cut it. I can hardly feed my family. Someone should really think about creating a livable wage in Georgia. Not to mention how investors play a part in this and the environment. I think I heard J. Kyle Bryant saying something about this in the other room. Come on, let's eavesdrop.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Stakeholders Roundtable for this Environmental Justice Awareness Symposium. I am J. Kyle Bryant, the moderator of this roundtable, and I'd like to thank you all for being here today. And I'm going to share with you a few objectives of this roundtable, and they are basically to provide information to strengthen the evidentiary link between historic inequities and current environmental conditions, to inspire community leaders, academia, business and industry, and civil society to think about how systemic racism relates to their work on examining the roots of environmental injustices, and to align community-based organizations with strengthening and strategizing ideas in the area of EJ and create a cohesive environment for fruitful partnerships, as well as create intellectual firmness around dealing with systemic racism in a rigorous manner so the grassroots groups can understand and discuss race and systemic racism's impact on environmental and economic health in our communities. And with that, I'll dive into my first question for the panel. And you don't have to respond in order. It's just, we'll just make this very open and informal. So we have some questions that were first submitted by Nathaniel Smith that dealt with environmental justice and its relation to climate justice. So first question is, why is climate justice a racial equity issue?
Talk about climate justice, the root of that is extraction. And when you talk about environmental justice, the root of that is extraction and the byproducts of that extraction. And so in order to really create justice for one, you have to create justice for another. I mean, climate can never be just if it is not just for Black people. And that's something that we have to be willing to say and continue to press towards.
And when I mentioned the use of technology, I wasn't just speaking of from the regulatory agency perspective. I was speaking more from the grassroots level up because I think communities are getting to a point where they are losing trust in those who are considered experts and subject matter experts and officials. And I am more of an advocate for self-preservation, the first law of nature, to be able to look at your circumstances and be able to document what's happening to you. Teaching a community how to do their own exposure histories, or how many people have died of cancer in my neighborhood, or how many people have complained about smelling fumes from the factory across the street more than twice this month or this week or what have you. How many people have had pets that are outdoors whose hair has fallen off or have died or gotten sick and got tumors and things like that. These are all patterns of environmental exposures. And so if you could teach them to do baseline investigatory work and document that and say, okay, for this entire community, here's every house and these people have these illnesses, and neighbors are willing to share that personal data with each other. But when it comes to working through agencies, of course, there's all kind of HIPAA requirements and things that you cannot share. So these are tools that I would advocate for communities to use, but we all know that communities have some limitations. They're all different, and they come with different levels of capacity building. And I have experienced that in trying to work with communities when I see what the challenges are, and you see the quality of life issues that they face, and finding someone who's a champion, who's really who's on fire for what you're talking about and wanting to do something, but you find out their limitations to their abilities too. And it's mainly because when you go there as a representative of an agency or a firm, someone who's getting paid for billable hours, and the only person around the table not getting paid is the community person who's being mostly impacted. Right. So the passion goes out if there's not an economic stimulus to go along with it. And a little honorarium helps now and then. I mean, even to get people to come to a community meeting, sometimes you have to bribe them with a couple of buckets of chicken and some gallons of tea to hear what you got to say. And that's unfortunate, but that is what it is. I mean, you know, they often say in the EJ movement, we care less about what you know until we know that you care. That's an old line. But let's talk in a little deeper dive about the community and defining the community and capacity building. I do a lot of work in helping communities understand how to use some of these communication tools and helping them really think about what it means to be a community and understand their power dynamics in relation to other communities and with governmental entities and what have you. But basically, I conclude that there's 5 real things communities need to know. And they need to have a sense of their resources, their history, their sense of power, their values, and their own institutional assets. And speaking of institutional assets, as we all know, the church is probably the biggest institutional asset in most communities. So that's the low-hanging fruit to where you want to try to start engagement. But that's not everybody. You still have to get Pookie and Ketchup to still come too. So you have to sit on Miss Mary's porch and drink a glass of tea and see pictures of her grandkids and talk about how the neighborhood used to be before you start talking about what you're there for. We know that. But let's talk about some other common sense ways that we can engage these communities to get them to understand that it's, you know, it goes back to what most of us probably learned in kindergarten, the 10 most important 2-letter words. If it is to be, it is up to me. It takes you having self-determination to be able to pull yourself out of it, as we learned with Hurricane Katrina and many other natural disasters. No one's coming to your rescue immediately, at least. So what can you do for self-preservation of yourself and your loved ones and the people in your community? What can we do to educate our people that this is our fight to fight? And, I mean, we are foot soldiers that are trying to use the resources in our respective groups and organizations to enlighten them or to get them engaged. But there are some simple things they can do to empower themselves. Let's talk about what some of those things might be. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about your opinions about power dynamics.
So let me just add one kind of preface before we kind of move in that direction. I think that it's also important that if anyone who enters into a community to support it and to serve it also has to love it. And I think a lot of times we have a lot of people who enter into communities who want to serve the people, but they don't love the people. And love is a transformational force that we have to embrace when it comes down to working with communities and building power. So that has to be a key ingredient for anyone who wants to work in the community and make change happen. And that's love of people. The second thing is, I think is like really, really important, is that we have to also make sure that the community understands that resilience is not enough. Survival is not enough. We're not talking about surviving, we're talking about thriving, right? And I think a lot of times when we work in communities, they because they haven't been exposed to certain things and they've had this history of oppression, this history of structural injustice, that they think that being resilient and surviving is enough. And we have to get them out of that mindset that you deserve more than just to survive. You deserve to thrive. And here are ways in which you can engage in your community around key policy issues and other issues that will create conditions for you to thrive and not just survive. I just wanted to kind of set that preface. I'll take a step back and, I can provide examples, but I just think it's really important for us to not center this conversation on survival or resilience. We're talking about creating a community where everybody can reach their full potential, right? And everybody has a chance to receive not only what they need to survive, but to thrive. And so I just want to elevate the conversation a little bit, and hopefully that'll influence the feedback that people are providing.
I think that's important because I think, environmental justice is interdisciplinary. When we all determine where we're going to enter it, whether it's in the health sphere or law or policy or communications, or equity, but everyday people, they're scared. And they're living in fear, and they're living with a scarcity mindset. And just because you're coming in with your degree and your position, and you don't live there, right? There's still a bit of a divide there. And just because your skin color looks like them, you may not have the same lived experience. And so you do have to be very open-minded, and you do have to have a lens of love to make sure that you're really listening and receiving the information that people are giving to you. One of the things that really sparked me to be in this work is just, as an environmental justice attorney, being at a air permitting where they're, the agency is saying, we want to expand this landfill and it's not going to be harmful and it's clean, and you're trying to convince this community who's already overburdened with a trash transfer station, a biomass facility, an incinerator, you name it. I think that you're most effective in doing environmental justice work, no matter what your discipline is because you do have this sense of love and empathy and wanting to see results. Not stuck on process, but actually seeing the improvement of the quality of life that's going to last, that other people are going to be able to maintain when you're gone.
Right.
And that's what I'm talking about from the standpoint of scientists of color and people in the regulatory bodies. What value you can bring other than you probably being hired to do those kind of jobs because you're a safer face in those sacred spaces. But it's better that there needs to be training for those people to say, look, like they say, all your skin folk ain't your kin folk.
Exactly.
So, but you need to be a trained scientist to understand those variables are at play and to know how to do a windshield survey and say, okay, I see more than my counterparts see. When I come into this community, okay, this is a food desert. This is a health desert. Where are we getting the groceries from? No wonder everybody buys the South meat down at the corner store, and there's no fresh vegetables, but there's 11 different flavors of blunt rolling paper. How that happened? There's no fresh fruit. But I wrote a side story when I was at Fort Valley State as a STEM major undergraduate. I lived across from one of those kind of convenience stores, and I used to go over there, and the little kids in the neighborhood would get honey buns and stuff like that. And I was like, I've never seen honey buns in a suburban convenience store, only in the hood stores. I said, Little Debbie has a conspiracy against black people. Only black people eat honey buns. I've never seen a person who was not of color eat a honey bun. They might get a bear claw or some fruit, but not a honey bun. I said, that's a hood treat.
You're on something there.
So I was like, so is there something to that? I said, is it that we just have this natural inclination towards honey buns, and so they put them there for us? Or is it that they're trying to just over-sweeten us? Like you have 20 different flavors of Mad Dog, but you can't find that in Gwinnett County, but you can find that in Riverdale. Right. What's up with that? And so all of that is a systematic plan to keep you at a certain level. But I say that as scientists, we need to see those things and see what is the bigger picture here, and how do the regulatory agencies and the political processes play into keeping the status quo. And so that's why it's incumbent upon our communities to build their capacity to define their own impairment and then demand different policies. Like I am more in favor of seeing, instead of talking about environmental justice communities, having toxic zones and talking about, okay, well, since we're being bombarded by all these industries and all of these food deserts and health deserts and all these poison centers you'll call convenience stores and in our community that have non-nourishing foods and things, then there should be incentives for having to live here. And all the transfer trucks come through our neighborhoods to go to these incinerators and landfill facilities. And so what is trending is that suburbanites are tired of 2.5-hour commutes into the inner city. So what was blighted properties like Bankhead Highway, changed its name to Hollowell again, because there's plans to gentrify that area. And just like I mentioned to some of you earlier about Liberty City, Florida, which is a regular staple on the First 48, one of the highest crime areas in the country, and the Pork and Beans projects that were noted for some of the most violent public housing ever created. That area of Miami was created first for veterans, African American veterans that came home from World War II, and they created I think it was some 12 city block area first for Liberty City, and they've expanded somewhat. But when they built I-75 or I-95 corridor through there, they split that community. And the eastern part went to the South Beach area in Little Haiti, and the western part was a smaller portion that was remained for African Americans. That area is now being rebranded as Model City because the name Liberty City is synonymous with high crime and bad people and all of this. But when you create, as a regulatory agency, create fact sheets that are in English, but that's a three-culture community. You have African Americans, you have Haitians, and you have the Latino community, all surviving in that one small, densely populated area. So I thought, it was smart to start creating fact sheets for the contaminated sites in that community that are in their languages, in Haitian Creole and in Spanish, and then do them in different colors. So as people come in and they see their language, the green fact sheet is for me, and the yellow one is for me. So you can see, there's more Latinos in the room tonight. There's more Haitian people in this room. They're interested in the groundwater studies that we're doing. These are innovative things that representatives of agencies can do to let the people know, hey, they cared enough to speak to me in my language, so that means they must want me to know this. Those are things at the agency level a black scientist or a person of color can bring to the table, and not just to put an ad in the Miami Herald when there's a Latino newspaper or a circular for the Haitian community that you totally overlooked. Things like that. These are things that have benefited having us at the table. America learns valuable lessons when we have a seat at the table, when we finally have a presence to put a voice in the room. That doesn't mean that we don't have a long way to go. I think, though, while we're waiting on that day to come, it's still important for our communities to build their own capacity. And to that end, I want to talk about things like, when I talk about power dynamics, if you're unfamiliar with that term, that's power dynamics influence your decision to speak up in meetings with supervisors. That power dynamics that we have as professionals, but there are power dynamics exhibited between communities. Communities know their sense of power in relation to other communities. It's the Bankhead versus Buckhead culture. It's like, it's to a certain extent accepting the fact that you are going to be treated unfairly or treated differently. You know that, and you know that there's little you can do about it. But what are some things that you think we can do to help communities understand how to combat the power of indifference in our communities?
I think like a lot of stuff starts with education. They have to understand how they as an individual are involved in that process from the beginning to end, right? I think a lot of people are starting to see that through our political system, right? Like that's a process where that if you as an individual, you might think that you as an individual is not really making a difference, but in the whole system, in the process, if you participate in that, you'll see that voice means a lot. When you guys were talking about Miss saying that one person that loves their community, that person always stands out, right? They always get the mic. Everybody always shuts up because that's the person who loves and dedicated to their community. I think when children in a community actually see somebody speaking with power to those who have been elected, that is transformative for them as a youth. This is one memory I got in my head where that my mom, my dad, they did like tons of community outreach. You talking about people that love their community. You know, they were doing stuff for free for people. They were taking care of people's kids. They were doing like computer literacy, getting old computers and building them and doing performing arts. But they didn't really get the support from their political leaders like they should, right? They went to a city council meeting. I remember me, my brother, my sister, and a couple of other kids, they were up there talking. And I never heard my mom curse or get loud ever in her life. And they were up there pretty much trying to say, we needed some more resources because there's a need here, right? And for that particular moment, I talked to people, because this happened maybe like 20 years ago, and I talked to the kids that was in that program, and they talk about that experience to this day, right? So that, you know, if you're going to one of these meetings and stuff like that, you should bring some kids, your son, your daughter, somebody, friend, a neighbor, bring them to those meetings so they can actually see that, yeah, you have a voice here. So they won't think that when they get older, me coming to something like this, my voice is not mattering, right? Because there's people who probably know about stuff like this, but they might think in their head, oh man, I'm not going to go to the parents thing. What I'm going to say that's going to make a difference, right? But, you know, it could be that one little kid that sees you actually doing that. That's going to really kind of just spark them to really taking that first step of voicing what's on their mind to really start switching that power dynamic. And like I said earlier, you know, holding those people accountable. You know, somebody going there, raising some fuss up at a council meeting, you know, people's going to, you know, especially if they speaking some truth to what's going on, right? And then you got a council person up there who you already know, they might say something, you've seen it, the YouTube clips and stuff like that, where that person is telling the truth, and then the council person pretty much just, you know, pushes them over to the side, and that's never a good look.
So, I mean, and that's an excellent point. You know, I just think that it's interesting. We're alive during a point when we will see this country become more majority minority, like in brown people. So my question would become, as it relates to environmental justice, and even beyond that, when you have a cultural change, you are going to view all of the policies differently than they were originally intended. And so what kinds of things do we need to be thinking about in terms of addressing some of the environmental inequities as a community? I believe in working with the youth, and I think civics is important, and we haven't had enough teaching of civics. We've lost that. And so reintroducing what civics is and what a majority minority country would think about in terms of environmental activism and what is fair and equitable and what needs to be readdressed and re-examined and reimagined.
But again, it's a mindset, and we have to begin the process of pushing that mindset if we want change. Go ahead, sister. I don't want to.
Well, you talked about shifting the paradigm.
Right.
Shifting that paradigm. Again, talking about education and awareness within our households, with our children, especially in the school system. If it's not there, then let's create it. As you said, you're starting an academy of some sort, and that's what we need to do in our places at Morehouse School of Medicine, Center of Leadership. We're training and shifting that paradigm. We don't need to have approval from no one else. We are going to create it on our own. And I love what you talked about, that shifting that, and let it be sustainable. If it's not funded, that's okay. We're going to pull it together. You know, I presented my family reunions. You know, I'm the person. You know, here she go again. Talking about I mean, what? You know, they gonna put out the cigarette for 20 minutes. They gonna go back. But you know, they go back out. Yeah, they go back out. But I'm talking to them because hoping, my little cousin can see me and say, "Wow, okay, what school did you go to?
That's right.
You know, what did you do? So what are you talking about again?" So it's at least sparking something, but shifting that paradigm and starting there is a key point. I think that we need to do.
And when we're talking about shifting the paradigm, we need to understand that government can't fix all the needs in every community.
That's right.
It has to come to a point where people in the community say, we need to stand up for something. And that is when we need to start pushing back and allowing the nonprofit sector to remedy a lot of those market failures that can provide the community control that people are looking for. For instance, in my program at Clark Atlanta University, I'm studying community sustainability through things such as community land trusts. I don't know if y'all are familiar with community land trusts, but they allow you to own land towards living wage housing, sustainability, whatever the community needs are. Those type of ways put the community quite literally at the forefront of what its needs are, what its wants are, and the interweave between private interests as well as legislatures and the sort, so that the community's voice can always have a say on what they want in perpetuity.
So I think also just add to that too. I was looking at your mask and talking about the vote, part, and as someone's mentioned, holding those who are we've elected. It's a new wave with this political landscape that we need to hold individuals accountable and be really vigilant about it. As we said, someone said, turning Georgia blue or purple or whatever. No, it's still there. We know there's some remnants outside of Atlanta, right? It's Atlanta and it's Georgia. It's real deal. Just this time, right? And hopefully, but we know that it's still there. But even if you talk about regulatory agencies and who's now leading Interior, I think the Interior Department, who's leading the EPA now? And again, okay, so just because the color, they have our color, do they really represent us? So we need to hold individuals accountable and knowing that we have that power as well. To hold them accountable, we have that voice. And if you're not going to do it, I'm creating my own, correct? So that's what we need to do. And so that's what we need, regardless of who you're working for, what you're doing, your nonprofit, your private, or you're working by yourself, that is something that we need to do. Is hold individuals accountable and be really vigilant about that.
You also have to have that succession plan, that those other people who are coming up behind you, or if you are where you are, then who else are you bringing on with you?
That's right.
So if you don't have that next person that's with you on the left or the right, then your vision kind of fails, and then you have to restart it all over again with that person that's no longer with it, and then you say, we need to get back to environmental justice. Like, we did that before in '82. We did that before in the '90s, and now so you have but you don't have to. You have to have that succession plan, and I think a lot of times we probably don't have that because you are fighting that battle by yourself, or you don't have that next person.
I think one of the most important things that we have to do is educate and teach that it's not just about casting that vote and then walking away, but it's about holding that person accountable for what they say they want to do. If you say you're going to do something to help fix the water or make our communities better and stuff like that, then we need to, I want to say another word, but we need to stay on them about making sure they do what they want to do because we cast a vote for them, so we got to hold them accountable.
So, if I can interject, so I have a real life example. I used to work for a chemical division of a big company, and they actually had it was in a community of color, and it was some problems. They had complaints, but then until there was an actual release of a significant amount of chemicals, and the EPA was brought in, that there was a true change made. Now, I will say, I remember in the meeting room, there was maybe about twice the size of this. One of the managers, he said, "Hey, they don't want us to put the building back or the plant back, but they don't have the money to fight us." And so they put it back, but what they did do is they started that community involvement, and Miss Ann came in, and she's the head of that board, and she holds them accountable for everything that they do. So if there's a smell, she calls directly to that plant manager. And so they were able to do that, but they were only able to do it with everybody down at the table.
And the only thing I was going to say is that you have to still, that community involvement, that walking and talking with your neighbors, walking maybe hands-on or somebody in the community. When I first moved to Atlanta, you used to see on the news, they were recognizing that community activist, that average person, where I don't see that anymore. Mm-hmm. But for that community to have buy-in, somebody has to still be on the ground to either walk and talk and meet with those people. And sometimes I think we are at a disadvantage because you are working, and if you want to really go out and meet that next person, when does that happen? Is it after hours? But now everybody's concerned about safety. So, but you still got to have that connection, that buy-in with the.
As you talk about in terms of making it factorial, meaning that of course technology, but also going to the churches, barbershops. I have led some of the barbershop initiatives. beauty salons, nail salons, laundromats. That is something that we continue to do, and you have to do that. As you talked about going to, the pool halls, going to, we've been AAU meetings, and actually going to the schools, because that's another mechanism of how you get education about, environment or things that, some parents don't really see, but you have to put it into, working, for example, with Head Start, put it into some parental engagement, requirements that they have to do. Okay, we're going to set aside this segment for nutritional eating and demonstrations. So that's how you kind of have to integrate it with those, to me, I call it just a reframing of education, a reframing of your health communication and health literacy and delivery of what you need to have in that message that you're talking about. So climate crisis, that's what has to be done in terms of those, things that have to be the field, going out with the boots on the ground information.
The people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
That's it.
And when I mentioned the use of technology, I wasn't just speaking of from the regulatory agency perspective. Okay, so you can teach farming. You can teach sustainable agriculture. We have connections with Ag Extension Agency. That's a mandate of a land-grant university. So teaching our black farmers to grow food for our black grocery stores and things like that. If we have to evaluate, reimagine everything in order to survive, because as we worry about things like climate change and growing storms and things like we've experienced this year, we know that our communities, when the rest of America catches a cold, we're going to catch COVID.
That's right.
So we better have a plan, which is part of what I focus on in my doctoral research, on focusing on what could be a very ugly future unless we have a plan for ourselves, and looking at risk and resiliency and the things that we can do in a practical way to bring all of these resources together to at least start focusing on planning for worst case scenarios. But again, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And I enjoyed it, and I hope this turns out well when they're ready to air this for the actual symposium. But thank you for your time.